What we're going to do for the next 50 minutes, we get kind of two parts to this. One's a panel, and then a few presentations. What we're going to do is again, because we're looking specifically at Europe, and we've got the different phasings of the countries and building up assets. I think it's fascinating. You know, the UK kind of being the last of, or one of the more recent of the markets to develop, having watched Spain and Italy and Germany and Czech Republic and Greece, and a lot of the issues kind of just crop up again and again. And then by the time the UK gets around to installing its 10 gigawatts of ground mount or something, you're actually seeing a lot of the investors and the EPCs having gone through a learning process in Southern Europe. What I'm going to ask you to do is think about one question, and because we've kind of aligned this so that we're looking at Spain, Germany, and Italy. So the kind of question to think about after the introduction is, what do you see? What's the biggest takeaway, positive takeaway from Spain, Italy, Germany's matured market in terms of owning solar assets?
In terms of solar size, we are the second biggest European solar operator with 850 megawatts in operation and more than a gigawatt worldwide. In terms of takeaways from the Italian market, I think that, at least at Foresight, so I speak for what we have learned from the Italian experience, is how to structure and manage the assets, and in terms of both the contractual things that we need to look for and then also the building capabilities. So I think that the fact that we had the majority of our learning curve in terms of assets that we built there, then we could actually transfer the know-how to the UK. I think we learned the fact that also bank financing is a risk. Nobody thought that was something that applied, and but at the same time, I think bank taught us to look at certain other risks that we wouldn't have thought about if we hadn't had those projects financed. Then somebody can say, and that includes me, that probably they are super overcautious on some matters and they force you to overpay in certain situations, but it's the dynamic of project finance that is structured that way. So I would say that I think those are the biggest takeaways that we had so far.
I'm responsible for the renewable energy funds at HG Capital. In particular, we manage two dedicated funds for renewables in Europe. We invested we were early movers in Spain back in the old days, 2008, 2010. And we've been not very active since, after we got the pleasure of being mistreated by the Spanish government on the retroactive changes. But the interesting part is we've been owning a portfolio of about 60 megawatts of solar for now 8-9 years, and for us, takeaway has been actually some surprises on the upside when it comes down to cost efficiencies and reductions of the O&M. It was mentioned in the panel earlier, yes, it's marginal because you can only do so much with the plant if you buy it when it's operational, which is true in the first year or two. But actually, when years go by and you start seeing your original EPC window kind of fall over, and you actually do have the opportunity to tender a large portfolio, we've seen more competition than we expected, and the potential, and actually more improvements in cost than we did expect, to the point of, and we can maybe talk later about some of the details, but that was a positive takeaway.
Dirk Raab, Allianz Global Investors. I'm responsible for the portfolio management of the infrastructure equity department. And so far we have raised 3 funds. 2 are fully invested. The last one is just hunting down the last investments. And with these 3 funds, we have about 1.8 billion assets under management in the renewable areas, so solely wind and solar assets. Regarding our solar portfolio, we have about 400 megawatt peaks across Europe, which means 1 bigger investment in UK, also in Denmark, in Germany, in France, and some smaller investments in Italy. Regarding the German market, I think everybody knows we had seen quite a nice rise of new projects until 2012. And with a cut of subsidies, the market completely broke down. So even Germany is our home turf, and we have some nice investments from the period before 2013. We can't consider Germany being really a place to invest as of today. With new renewable energy law, it is just doesn't make any sense to invest with fund structure in these small solar plants. And what we also see in Germany is that solar becomes more and more a commodity, which leads to the fact that the fees chargeable by our service providers, O&M, technical advisors, as well as commercial managers are going down and putting them under pressure and getting more creative and more efficient in all terms, which means starting with data and reporting to make it more efficient. I think we'll having a session on that tomorrow also. But we also see some centralization of services, or also we do see a potential or a high potential for standardizing contracts and getting more efficient with that.
So, having asked for some of the positive takeaways, and I'm going to stay with the theme of learning. What went really wrong with the owning and building up portfolios in each of the countries? What was an absolute? What was a disaster? Not disaster. I was told not to use the word what went bad, but what could be improved on in the future. So where were the things that in terms of building up the knowledge base that you use now? What were the pitfalls? What were the things that were didn't work out and you would do much better, or you are doing much better now?
I think that the first plants that we have built were not exactly the best plant that could have been built. And the reason was that the market wasn't mature. Some of the technical advisor actually didn't have a clue about what they were commenting on. I have, for example, a 1 megawatt plant that shadows a little bit himself. The reason was that it was a double axis tracker, and it was one of the first to be installed in Italy, and probably the calculations weren't done properly. So you learn about these little things. Then obviously you compensate that on the plant because you well written the contract, and since the performance was not as good, you actually reduce the overall price so that you are ISO IRR on your investment. However, you learn how to do better the due diligence to look for the things that you should have done better. And also I think what we have learned is to negotiate better the financing with the banks. And one of the things that we have learned the most, and I think is one of the negatives about Italy, but I have seen and I've heard feedbacks similar in other countries, is the bank's agency, which is probably the worst things banks do. They're very good at selling you the product, they're very good at selling you the financing, they're very good at structuring it, but the minute you need to change something, it takes forever. So you submit your waiver request, you send them all the documents, they appoint the advisor, they make you spend more money in getting the waiver than actually the physical saving that you make on reducing the O&M cost. I had an experience with one of the top Italian banks to whom I've submitted a waiver request to change the O&M in February for them to approve it by the 1st of August, because that was the date in which the O&M should have changed. On the 29th of July, they told me they wanted an MRA. So I'm like, you know what, whatever, I'm going to change it. I don't have the waiver, I'm going to sign the new contract. So that's the kind of things that I think we have learned. And you need to be smarter in regulating in the agreement, the fact that they need to have some response time. If they don't respond within a certain period of time, you're actually more free to do what you want to do, and that cannot affect any distributions, because obviously they also play the other kind of game. And then since you're not complying with the agreement, they can also stop you the distribution. That's the leverage against you. So those are the things that probably we have learned the most.
Yes. Spanish market, nothing went wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So offline. I was smiling earlier because disaster and Spanish PV are basically synonyms, and it's almost like hard to slice and dice negative or let's say experiences when you have such a big swing factor that happened. But I think what was more subtle is the impact that the regulatory changes had on the ability to manage the portfolios and that goes through actually point in line with what Federico just mentioned around the lenders, and it's around alignment of stakeholders. So one thing we noticed was that once the worst retroactive changes were put in place in 2013, the equity yield was pretty much wiped away from our portfolio, which led to a bit of a stalemate situation because at the same time there was the opportunity to reduce costs because some of the original contracts, actually the second round of contract reductions could have been put in place, so there was an actually tangible saving to be made. I think that's been a learning across different markets. There are risks in the field that you don't really see beforehand, just because everything is so new, and therefore the response of actually investing unlevered, I think, is probably the best one that we've seen.
Dirk, what's been the...
Luckily, we haven't had any real disasters in Germany as well.
Just installed too much too quickly.
Just cutting subsidies, but which was really a hard disaster for the developers. I think our most important learning was just from the beginning that we have to have real technical experts in our team. So solely commercial asset management does not work out, and you can't run a fund with only financial engineering. You really have to have these technical field engineers, field experts in your team, being able to talk the same language with our O&M and technical advisors and so on. And there is really a huge potential with it. So from our strategy, we have a buy and hold strategy. So we buy the assets and manage them over time of 20-25 years. And there's always potential for improvement.
What were the factors that led you to say, right, we need that technical know-how? I mean, what were the problems?
It started just that all your partners try to cheat you. They tell you anything, and you have to be close, really close from a technical point of understanding. Because I think it's a natural development. Our O&Ms, they are used, if they are working with funds, they know that they're working with finance managers. And so the reality is just that they try to cheat you, and then you have to have the understanding in your own team to really manage it out. But it's the same true story for everything, I think.
I'm sure in the next couple of days we'll get the O&Ms up to protect their good names. They seem to be getting hit a little bit here. They will get their revenge. How could asset manager? No, sorry. I'm looking at this again in terms of the questions. This is going to keep coming up, so I think we're going to have to dive into it. The O&M. Why is all the questions on the O&Ms are so loaded? Does the low price of O&M services worry you? I can't remember.
Yes.
Should O&M prices vary plant by plant? Because it's goodness me. Right. So let's try and work in O&M learnings, right? Because let's talk about some positives. Let's give them back some credibility. O&M learnings by country. Now, it's I'm trying to. Because I guess when you see a lot of the markets, you see a lot of the utility scale solar developing, and when markets start from scratch, it tends to be local developers, local EPCs, and then of course everyone jumps into the market. But the initial movers are absolutely the local, and a lot of the initial O&M work is done by local players that are not playing across Europe. So when I look at the UK market and the O&M landscape today within the UK it's completely different to as the industry developed. and we had, you know, EPCs that were coming in, you know, a bunch of them literally, you know, not here anymore, that developed a lot of sites in 2011 and 12 and 13. But then we had, you know, some of the European EPCs coming in that naturally became the O&M, who were very experienced. So we had like the Martifers and the Grupotex and the Vote Solar. So these guys had, you know, done a lot. So the O&M side was a combination of EPCs like Solar Century that were largely UK specific. And now, if you look at the O&M landscape, it's a lot more consolidated. And in the UK, we've got, you know, we're largely mapping out the asset owner to a preferred partner across all the sites. So, you know, if we look at, you know, everything Octopus owns, and then, you know, Lightsource effectively taking that whole O&M bundle, and if you go across the different assets. So, John, just answering the question first from a UK perspective, and what I would also do is split up the, you know, the O&M into, I don't know what the terminology is, lead O&M and subcontracted O&M, and that's the other thing I see is this kind of split between, you know, having a really well controlled lead O&M who's doing an entire portfolio. And then kind of below that, you've got a very well qualified, so it's much more structured. So, you know, in terms of how the UK has evolved from an O&M standpoint, it's become much more, let's say, organised. And probably it's happened because the market slowed down and it's allowed everyone to say, well, kind of got everything we're going to buy, subject to a few 1.2 rocks. And that's kind of forced the consolidation and optimization. So I guess, you know, if we kind of look at what, I'm trying to give a good answer there, so learn from the answer. So again, if we go country by country, you know, where are the things that, you know, in terms of the O&M, how is it, where do you see the learnings from the different countries? Is it still country specific when we look at Spain, Italy and Germany?
Well, no, I think the players are international, so that you have some international players that play in Italy. The thing is, obviously, what you were saying before is the fact that some of original EPC have been disappearing in the O&M space, is because the very nature of how EPC and O&M are structured is that in the first 2 years you want to have only one point of liability. So you don't want to split the two things, because otherwise the EPC will blame the O&M if something goes wrong and vice versa. So after a while, that depended on the strategy of the various EPC, where they wanted to grow the O&M business, they stayed in the business, but if then they had some constraint in continuing being EPC, obviously they also lost the O&M part of it, because obviously the company went bust or something. So what are the good learnings? I think that what we have experienced is the fact that independently from what O&M you have selected, you need to be sure that they have men on the ground. And it's not a man on the ground in terms of just simply outsourcing to a company there. It's somebody that physically goes day in, day out to the plant. So you need actually to do some surprise visits and see whether somebody's there. And maybe you need to do it over the course of a week to see, because obviously the plant doesn't need daily look after, but then once a week you need to go and see anything went wrong, because obviously in Italy in particular, where the weather, it looks very sunny, but it's also very windy, it's very rainy, it's very snowy, and depending on where you are, that you have different things. Last week, mid of April, we have the plant in Abruzzo covered in snow. So you need to be sure that somebody's there then to give it a clean to the panels, to see whether the snow had made any damage to the plant, and so on. So if then you come to the price of O&M, we have seen completely different prices between Italy and the UK. One of the drivers was also the fact that banks wanted you to have a complete full service, and then back in the day everybody was pricing it per megawatt, which I don't know if today is the right way of pricing O&M, because if you have a 50 megawatt plant, why should it cost the same that if you have a 3 megawatt plant? Probably the 3 megawatt costs more than the 50 megawatt plant per megawatt. By having said that, I am concerned about the fact that we go towards this increase in price reduction on the O&M till a physical limit. And I have learned, being in business, that if you spend peanuts, you buy monkeys. So at a certain point in time, you're going to find yourself that obviously, yes, you're saving on the O&M, but actually the service is not being done because you're paying so low and the market is so competitive that it's impossible to manage the plant having physical people doing the job. And that's my takeaway on that.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I guess, along similar lines, I mean, our portfolio in Spain is not of massive size, it's much smaller than Foresight, but our experience has been, we did the first round of cost reduction after the first O&M period expired, so after final takeover, and we tendered, and in that case, so we're talking about, it was 2011, it was a large European incumbent who actually won the contract, and I think that's actually goes in analyze what you were saying, consolidation. It was seen as just the same name, and that led to roughly a 20% reduction. So we're talking about, just simplifying, on per megawatt basis, we were in a 24, 25 euro per megawatt, 1,000 euro per megawatt region, 20% down from that. And that was another 3-year period. And the second 3-year actually led to a different dynamic, where it was actually a local Spanish company who won the tender. And I wonder whether, I don't know if it's something representative of the market, but you could definitely see that the Spanish, let's call it ecosystem, evolved to a point where the local players were structured enough to win tenders for large, relatively large portfolios and be very competitive. And so I would be curious to see if similar kind of patterns happen in different markets. The second takeaway, at least for us as a fund manager and investor, has been to let's say, not listen to what you've been told, but actually systematically go and seek for external proof and information. So we, specifically in the second round, we didn't expect a lot of cost savings. We just kind of already squeezed once. But we decided anyway to take one of our trusted advisors, almost like a team member. I mean, really somebody who's been working for many years, and ask them to run a tender with their own information. And we turned out with a surprise, with more savings than we expected, more competition than we expected. So.
It's fascinating. Some positive learnings from O&M in Germany.
Very many true points up so far, and I think really, and I have to point it out again, it is quite important. Our O&Ms may centralize services. It makes really perfect sense that they have a single place where they do the monitoring over the overall portfolio, but they really need to have guys close to the plant, able to react in time. That is quite important. And concerning the prices, from my point of view, it's really very, very difficult to compare prices. A good step in this direction would be something like standardization of contracts, which is not in place so far at all, and all contracts are different and really triggering lots of legal advice and makes it hard to compare services. And also concerning prices, you sometimes have the situation that you bought some assets from one developer, he's doing again the O&M part, and so some part of the purchase price is also in the O&M fees, and so if you just like to compare, it's just impossible.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how it's kind of evolved in different countries, and with not a huge amount likely to be added in Europe, other than what we're seeing in France. It's very kind of controlled from a capacity standpoint. Got the situation now where it is, it's consolidation and optimization, and I want to get back to another O&M question, but I just want to again throw out to audience, and let's keep on O&M just for a little minute.
I have a question. Actually, it's not about O&M. Is that all right? No, it's a question, but it's not about O&M. I would be interested in a reverse point of view, which is Germany and Italy, of course, but Spain is in a different situation. What is I understand it's a difficult question, but what is the level of IRR that you're actually getting from these two markets from solar? Because that's also comparative. It's not just the technical and the operational side. I would like also to know if the money invested, how much is it bringing back?
So I guess that's a good question, and this is Giovanni from JA Solar.
What money?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry? Okay. I am going to throw in the what IRR we're getting, but I guess let's have a look at it from some of the early plants that were built by country, and separate that from more recent stuff. So where we've got plants that were built like 10 years ago, more than 5 years ago. What are we seeing in those plants? And is this significant? Are just comments by country again, if Federico, if you can.
It requires a little bit of an introduction, the question, in order to frame it in the right way. I think this started as a business that was looking at it as a private equity type of investments, whereby in the early days of solar, starting from Spain, I was seeing plants bought for 6 to 7 million with IRRs close to 20%. Mm-hmm. The tariff was so high, and then there was this belief of the fact that you were financing the construction of the plant, then flipping it out to somebody willing to buy between 14 and 15, and then you have a second flip around 10%, and ultimately the third or fourth flip would have gone to a utility at 6%.
And everyone moaned then.
Yes. Now, over time, the situation has changed slightly, and you would have seen Italy, for the time that I remember it, that the investment was much more on the, let's say, mid-teen IRRs bracket, with somebody making more money, and probably was the EPC that was actually buying the permits, building the plant, and then still reaching the 20% IRR, but the typical financial investor was in kind of that bracket, which was a levered IRR with a very push leverage. I remember when I was at Deutsche Bank, we did 8 megawatts at 92% leverage.
So these were, so if you like,
at 16% IRRs.
This was the expectation at that
was the expectation.
And the delivery.
Then the delivery, I had to say that once you've done that type of investments in the first years before the cut in tariff, you were actually returning that kind of money. This is due to the predictability of actually the solar plants. And despite the fact that you might have some glitches in some of the plants, obviously the variance was like minimal, was in the region of 5% to what was expected in the financial model. And therefore you were actually achieving that. Then between that and actual distribution, you have some leakages in the structure, because obviously you were learning, and then the way banks actually postpone for 12 months your distribution because they want some additional data, notwithstanding you matching all the covenants. It's another matter. Now, post-cut-in tariff, I've seen everything. In the sense that I've seen plants in default that are still in default. Maybe it's not a structural default, so they still serve in the debt, but they cannot distribute, and it's a zero IRR, if you wish. Although you can look at it as back-ended from year 20 onwards, or after year 18, after you finish paying the debt, but obviously your IRR deteriorates. But let's put it in terms of yield, so it's zero yield. And then I've seen plants that have been...
Negative. Is it not negative?
No, it's still not negative IRR. It's still not negative IRR. Even though it's back-ended, it's low, but it's 5, 6. It's like in Spain. You've never seen a negative IRR if you're serving the debt. That's in our experience, at least.
You didn't lose your equity.
You don't have any yield,
Right.
but then if you wait until you have repaid the financing, then you'll get it all back-ended. How much you're going to get, it's a question mark, but if you put it on a financial model and make some assumptions, you reach the 4, 5, 6%, depending on your plant and depending how deep you are in your, let's say, average DSCR. So whether you're close to 1 or whether you are close to 1.15, okay? Still you can't distribute. Then post-cut-in tariff, so I've seen this, then you've seen some other plants that kept on distributing, and then there's the refinancing world that has allowed those plants that were invested in the bracket of the mid-teens IRR go back to somewhere in the region of 9 to 10 to 11, depending on the various structure, or 8, or even 8, I mean, I don't know. But that's the benefit of very low interest rate scenario that has been obviously available in the past couple of years due to the quantum easing from the European Central Bank. You've seen today negative Euribor, and now if you keep your deposit on your bank, actually the bank charges you to keep the money there. So That's the other side of the coin of this.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go along to the panel because I think that's generic. You were looking for a number, weren't you?
No, I would like to know if Germany and Italy were on the same level, because
No, far lower.
that's exactly what I wanted to get to.
But yeah,
Because he had less problems, but the returns were less. So I think that investors, we talk too much about technology that doesn't work, that the delivery service is not delivered. But what about today, if you invest money in a country that is riskier than Italy, Mexico, Latin America, I'm not even talking about India. Money there costs 4-5% for solar. So what do your investors expect today in Europe? Because that's the real question. For new plants. I'm not even talking for the ones that have already been installed.
right. Dirk, what do people expect now, today?
Well, it depends.
No,
Just considering a really conservative fund structure, we are managing over 25 years, buy and hold, buying on the secondary market, or just turnkey projects with really low risk. Our investors expect to receive, after all costs, 5 to 8% across Europe. I think that's fair and that's achievable. And going back to
Unleveraged or leveraged?
Leveraged.
leveraged, sure, leveraged. And it depends on the investor. So normally post-tax.
Okay, I'm wondering if we've actually, the O&Ms are now saved. Let's go to another question.
If you're looking for the magic number of the market in Italy for the big portfolios, you're looking at in the region of 7 to 8%. That's what we see in the transaction they've closed lately. Yeah.
Yeah, and just
Levered.
My name is Fernando. I work in Lightsource, renewable energy. It's going slightly linked to the O&M, but I wanted to know your experience once you've been owning assets for 10 years in Spain and Italy. I remember at the time we had huge maintenance reserves accounts with very expensive equipment. What is your experience of whether that reserve is used or not because the equipment is faulty? And second question, are there savings there? Because when the reserves were created 10 years ago, the prices of inverters or modules or structures were much more expensive than they are now. Because we don't have that experience, I guess, in the UK yet.
Yeah, fascinating. Who wants to pick that one up?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a stab at that. So the very good question. The short answer for Spain was that the banks were pushing the developers and sponsors to be more conservative than needed. So when we did our first round of, let's call it, tidy up after the initial O&M expired, all the MRAs were released, and we negotiated with the banks to, let them go. In exchange, of course, you got Siemens, bringing in Siemens as an OEM, you got other advantages. And we increased the level of, say, preventative maintenance across the board, rather than having cash being frozen in the assets. So that led to quite a lot of, savings when you look at the returns. So that worked, quite well as a combination. We don't see the need, or at least our experience has been for excessively conservative measures when it comes down to replacement of parts, because we have historically been pushing a lot the preventative side of the O&M.
Yes. So again, anyone else? You can either wait for me or stand up and shout.
That's all right. Okay.
Again, just introduce yourself.
Patrice Martial from Paypal Renewables. A couple of points in my question, really. Touching on the points that you've made. So you've spoken about the importance of having fast reaction times for more O&M providers. So two main things on that. In order to have fast reaction and man in the ground, you need a solid software monitoring company that can provide reliable data. Yeah. So the first level is there. It's always on the software, something that was touched earlier on in the discussion as well. So once you have that, and then you have man on the ground, then you can actually provide a service that has value. And touching on that as well, the second part is about availability of spare parts. Yeah. So having a man on the ground without the right kind of tools or the right kind of spare parts, then again you cannot provide the right kind of services. So as an asset manager or as an asset owner, you should be looking at 3 value-added points and not just the man on the ground. And on the second thing, I think we need to decide as an industry, and more you as the asset owners, whether you want a service provider or an insurance provider. So we've seen lately in the market being developed 2 different strategies. So companies that they still want to have the availability guarantees and the performance ratio guarantees, and other companies or asset providers that they say we're going to make a saving there, and we're going to actually allocate that to extend our inverter warranties, to extend our panel warranties, instead of paying someone to provide PR guarantees with a lot of exceptions. So I would like your comment on that.
I'm just gonna hold that one just now. I want to just see if there's any other questions. We've only got a few minutes to go. Shout or wait. Yeah, and stand up would help. Both.
Hi, it was about O&M scope. It was a question about, Dirk mentioned scope being a variable factor. In terms of the markets in Spain and Italy and Germany, has that scope of services kind of consolidated on what's required? And I ask that because there's variation between what an asset manager does, what an O&M manager does. Does he do land management? Is he just the electrical side of it? Who does the monitoring? And the sort of variation between what's required is one thing that I know O&M companies really strive to get certainty on. In those markets, more mature markets,
right.
has that developed?
Yeah, again, I'm just going to pause. Looks like it's going to be an O&M session. So I'm actually just want anybody with any final, not comments, but questions on an O&M side before I kind of wrap in all these comments to a final question, which has to be O&M and country specific. So we've got just over 5 minutes left. So yeah, it's you know, we've actually touched a lot on the O&M side, and it came up earlier as well in the panel session this morning. And you know, 1 or 2 of the questions were coming up about you know, is this something that you want to do in-house? Is it competitive? Is it more competitive to do it third party? But can you get the right control over a third party? Is that third party going to be too powerful as an O&M and have more control over the plant than you have? And then the other kind of things that were kind of thrown into some of the questions were so it's like, I guess I'd like your comments on the issue of in-house versus third party, and also I would say geographically global or pan-European expertise versus the benefits of what you have to have locally. Is that understood?
Yeah.
Good.
In-source versus outsource. As women like to say, it's a matter of size. So whether you have a certain number of megawatts that allow you to in-source the function, because the function has some setup cost, and obviously in order to do so, you need to make a certain type of investment, and you need to see a return on your investment. So that's the basic answer. Whether you are better off doing it internally or externally, in principle, I think it's a matter of the fact that generally when you do something yourself, you tend to do it better than somebody else because it's your own asset. So you tend to care about your stuff. I mean, you look after your house better than somebody can do it for you if you're not overlooking the person on a daily basis. So that's the kind of too simple answer to the question. Then obviously, if you need to do it on a pan-European scale, you can't be as effective as if you do it in a single country, also because in the country that we're talking about, the orography is very different. So doing O&M in the UK, it's rather simpler than doing it in Italy, because if you have a plant in Milan and one in Sicily, it's going to take a man in a van 42 hours to get on the van from Milan to Sicily. And obviously you need to have center of response more locally. If you base your O&M in the Oxfordshire, in 3-4 hours you're almost everywhere across England. Maybe you don't reach Scotland, but that's the kind of difference that you have in terms of orography. Spain is kind of the same. Madrid is at the center, but it takes you 6-7 hours to go around the whole country to the top north or south, depending on how it works. So there is no actual specific answer to the question. I think it depends on the features of your portfolio, on the location of your plants, and what you want actually to do. Because it's another business line, let's face it. And then some players use the O&M as, let's say, a different business line to be capable of beating competition in acquiring new assets because of the fact that they can replace existing O&M, have another stream of revenue, so they can bid better. So there is a series of elements that needs to be considered in this respect.
And the pure economy of scale comes into everything between now and 10 years ago. Luigi, in terms of your thoughts?
I would agree. And actually, starting with the internalizing versus externalizing, you can capture scale economies no matter which way you go. I think it goes really down to what is the probably sponsor's strategy and interest. So if, for example, if you're gearing up for a long-term ownership, then internalizing might make more sense. But if you're on a buy and sell model where after 5-7 years you're going to flip over maybe once or twice, then actually there's not much sense in internalizing. The thing I would kind of take away from our experience has been, well, even if you're contracting with external parties, is to watch out for, let's say, tenor, and always work with, say, 3 years maximum, 3-4 years, because the technology has surprised in its ability to improve. And actually, what you want is a contractor which is always going to be on their toes to deliver a level of service and cost. When it comes to the geography, I mean, our experience has been biased because we only invested in Spain. But if we look at wind, where we have been more widespread, UK, Ireland, Sweden, and other places, it is really difficult. It is really difficult to translate learnings from one country to another, because I think this is down to the fact that the industry is not as mature yet. As you said, each country has its own specific issues, and I think very few players have been able to really take advantage of broader geographical patterns.
Yes, and maybe adding to that, from my point of view, it's also important to have the commercial partners, the commercial managers located in the target countries. So it does not make any sense to centralize this, because the country specifics are too individual to have it centralized and not directly on the space. And just adding to the scope of services, I feel that it's trending to narrow it down to the real requirements. And we, for example, don't like full service contracts, and even we buy spare parts and have it on our own, and so it comes from our technical expertise, what is really required and what should we have in case of any issues.
But that's if the bank allows you to do that, because most of the time the bank doesn't allow you to say, look, let's have only this one. Even if you built up an MRA, they put some covenants on how you should source the spare parts, on what you should do, so it doesn't allow you sometimes to run it in an industrial way as you should be run, the O&M. And therefore take some of the risks, because the bank doesn't like them.
Yeah, so I'm just going to throw a question, just a final question, is just kind of starting to think about this, because quite often, Europeans can be very Eurocentric. Does it make any difference? Does it make any difference if all of a sudden the solar industry, from a supply standpoint, from a spare parts standpoint, all of a sudden becomes 80% is going to China and India? Does it, and Europe's less important? I'm just trying to think, because I started to think about, we're looking at, does it work, pan-European, and then I started to think, well, no point in even asking if are we really looking at something that works better globally? But I mean, is anyone seeing any impact from what's happening out in Asia at the moment? Just triggering through to the day-to-day stuff.
First of all, we don't have grid parity in Europe because of that. because we have an import tax duty on panels,
But
and
no
therefore,
no one's paying it now.
Yeah.
It's actually, everything's coming from Southeast Asia.
not as much as it should be. And then Chinese panel manufacturers come here and do the integrated EPC in order for them to do it on the balance of plants. And you cannot reduce the cost as much as you could have reduced them. And we could have had it probably a couple of years ago. And that's one point. The fact that the majority of the production will happen in Southeast Asia, I think it's a given in the sense that the way they build their plants and how they can scale up, it's incomparable to any other country in the world. And therefore, it's going to happen. The problem with the Chinese is that they tend to flood the market, and then they have some companies then basically going bust because they overflooded. The price goes so much down.
In China.
Nothing goes bust in China officially, but the companies get reaggregated together because obviously they can't compete anymore.
So is there? I'm just looking, a few years down the line. I mean, if all of a sudden, what new capacity coming online in Europe is a fraction of what's coming online there? I'm just wondering, at some point, your voice becomes much less globally. Does it matter? I mean, Luigi, is it?
Well, I don't kind of see patterns where they are not, but if you see what we've seen in Spain, which is the emergence of kind of local service providers which have taken the place or are taking the place of the large incumbents in let's call it in the second round of changes, that could be an answer. That you could start seeing kind of European kind of O&M consolidated but still local players emerging and taking simply over from the original equipment manufacturers. I guess that you lead to a very interesting point. What next? How long can China kind of do this for, and what will happen when they stop?
Oh, they'll just keep doing it. If they stop, then everyone's out of job. So they just change a 5-year plan. So I'm actually trying to think. Is it going to get to the point if you've got 200 gigawatts in China and 300 in India, is all the learning and like volume, maintenance actually going to come from there? Dirk, last word. How's globalization? No, globalization. How's the solar industry? Because I always say the solar industry's got two parts. It's got China, it's got Europe, and it's kind of got everything else. And in the past, when things were getting built, things were getting bought and maintained, it was all Europe. So literally, like then the rest of the world, in terms of like EPC and owning and maintaining, kind of had to, took what they've learned in Europe, and there must be stuff going on outside that will filter back here eventually. Are you seeing anything at all that's changed in the last, since all that capacity came online?
Just from our point of view, it is getting more and more important to also invest globally, not just to focus on Europe, but also to invest in the US, in Latin America, and all other possible areas. I don't see that tremendous effects on Europe because it is really important to have local partners in place. And you might have European hubs or centers, but you always need to have these guys close to the plants as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's why we said, the kind of like, the pan-European or the global doesn't work, but it can work for the global company if they've got local, right down to Europe, right down to the country, right down to the different parts of the country, and then effectively they're the domestic, local know-how. Okay, so we've come to the end of our session, and I hope that we've restored the credibility of all O&Ms, or prospective O&Ms. So if you could just like to thank the panel now for all of them.